The air in the square was thick with the scent of coal smoke and anticipation. Thousands stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the wooden platform. A low murmur rippled through the mass, then died instantly as the man in the center stepped toward the microphones. He did not wait for the applause to fade. He spoke of a new era, a nation rebuilt from the ground up, and a future where every citizen would be part of a grand national machine. He pointed toward a map unfurled against the wind, tracing lines that promised to bind the country together with ribbons of asphalt. He called it the Autobahn. The vision was absolute. It was not just a road, it was the spine of a transformed Germany. The crowd shifted, a collective surge of movement as the words landed. Thousands of hands rose in unison. The sound was deafening, a roar that drowned out the distant city traffic. He leaned into the microphones, his voice rising above the noise, cementing the promise of a modern, interconnected nation. The ambition was palpable, hanging heavy in the cool air, setting the foundation for the project that would define the decade. The heavy machinery fell silent, leaving behind an expanse of pristine black asphalt that sliced through the countryside. It was a marvel of engineering, a smooth, dark ribbon stretching toward the horizon, wider and straighter than any path the region had ever known. But as the weeks passed, the expected hum of commerce never arrived. The roads remained desolate. Grass began to push through the edges of the expansion joints. A solitary bird landed in the center of the lane, pecked at a pebble, and took flight without having to bank or swerve. There was no traffic, no trucks carrying goods, no families traveling to the cities. The scale of the construction mocked the reality of the people living in the villages nearby. They watched the road from their fence lines, walking their own paths on dirt tracks that ran parallel to the highway. The contrast was absolute. Millions of marks had been poured into a surface that existed solely for the sake of its own creation. It was a monument to movement that remained perfectly, hauntingly still. The silence on the highway was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the landscape, proving that the grand vision had outpaced the reach of the citizens it was meant to serve. The empty roads stood as an indictment of the national project. To fix the optics, the focus shifted from the pavement to the machine that would drive upon it. Hitler sat behind his desk, leaning forward until his face caught the sharp light of the afternoon sun. He summoned Ferdinand Porsche, the engineer known for precision, and laid out the terms of a new obsession. He wanted a vehicle for the masses, a machine that would render the empty highways a necessity rather than a failure. The demands were rigid and absolute. It had to carry an entire family. It had to maintain a speed of 100 kilometers per hour, even over long distances. And it had to be affordable, set at a strict limit of 990 Reichsmarks. Porsche listened as the political vision took shape, the requirements serving as the foundation for what would become the Volkswagen. This was not merely an engineering challenge. It was a mandate to manufacture consent through consumer ownership. Hitler gestured toward the maps, his voice cold and precise, outlining a future where every citizen would own the road. The industrial gears began to grind in response. The order was signed, the quotas established, and the transition from infrastructure to mass production commenced, setting in motion a project that would soon consume the nation's focus. To bridge the gap between the high cost of production and the average citizen's wallet, the regime unveiled a new mechanism, the savings scheme. It was pitched as a direct path to ownership, a way for every household to stake a claim in the future of the nation. Posters appeared in town squares, showing the sleek silhouette of a car rising like the sun over a suburban driveway. The math was simple. 5 marks a week, deposited into a government-run account. Citizens lined up at the local banks, clutching their ledger books with both hands. They watched the clerk count the coins, heard the sharp thud of the official stamp hitting the page, and walked away with a receipt that felt like a deed. It was not just an investment. It was an identity. For the first time, the factory floor felt personal. People talked about their future travel plans over dinner, calculating how many more stamps they needed before they could drive away from their front doors. The collective anticipation built a momentum of its own. Thousands of envelopes arrived at the central office daily, filled with the small, hard-earned currency of a population convinced they were building their own progress. The scheme functioned like a clock, ticking steadily toward a goal that felt increasingly tangible with every passing week of deposits. The registry grew with staggering speed, surpassing 300,000 participants. In kitchens across the country, families pored over maps, tracing routes they intended to travel once their final payment was logged. They spoke of the wind on their faces, the freedom of the open road, and the pride of driving a vehicle that belonged to the people. A father would clear the table, pull out the ledger, and show his children the growing stack of stamps that brought them closer to the dealership. It was a tangible, shared vision of progress. Neighbors compared their progress, sharing stories of where they would go first: the mountains, the coast, the quiet villages, far from the city noise. These were not just financial transactions. They were placeholders for a future that felt guaranteed. People saved with a religious intensity, skipping small luxuries to ensure the weekly 5 marks were ready. The anticipation was palpable, a quiet hum of excitement that permeated the public consciousness. They believed they were investing in a new era of mobility, unaware that their dreams were being measured by a different, darker set of priorities. For these thousands of citizens, the promise of the car was the promise of a life transformed, and they held that belief with absolute, unwavering conviction. The reality within the walls of Wolfsburg began to diverge from the glossy brochures sent to the public. Engineers were not designing for comfort. They were calculating for capacity. The assembly lines were not built for small family vehicles, but for heavy, reinforced frames. Workers hired to build cars found themselves installing machinery better suited for industrial output of a much more ominous nature. The vast, open spaces of the factory floor were not intended to facilitate the flow of consumer goods, but to accommodate massive, heavy-duty logistics. A quiet unease spread among the staff who noticed the blueprints changing overnight. They saw the dimensions of the loading bays and the depth of the foundations, structures that spoke of weight and durability far beyond the requirements of a passenger car. The dream of the people was being dismantled, piece by piece, replaced by the cold, calculated geometry of power. The speed of construction accelerated, yet the target remained hidden behind a shroud of state secrecy. Those who asked questions were met with silence or directed back to their stations. The factory was growing, not as a monument to mobility, but as a silent, hulking engine for something else entirely. The promise of the road was fading, leaving behind only the concrete structure of a machine designed to dominate, not to serve. The calendar turned to September 1939, and the pretense shattered. Across the border, the first tank treads tore into Polish soil, and the sound of that invasion echoed directly into the heart of Wolfsburg. Inside the facility, the atmosphere curdled. The assembly line stopped mid-motion. The workers who had been crafting chassis for passenger cars were abruptly ordered to clear the floor. Every machine was recalibrated, every blueprint burned. The factory did not transition, it was seized. Heavy steel plates replaced the light frames intended for families. The sound in the air changed from the rhythmic clatter of tools to the deep, guttural thrum of military hardware assembly. The doors of the facility, once meant to welcome citizens, were now shuttered and guarded by armed patrols. The dream of the open road had been a distraction, a thin layer of paint over a war machine. Trucks began arriving, not to take cars away, but to haul munitions out. The scale was immense, the pace frantic, and the objective was absolute. There was no room left for the private aspirations of the people. The factory had become the engine of the front line, and the silence of the workers spoke louder than the machinery that now dominated the landscape. The era of the consumer was dead. The 5-mark weekly deposits had been a ritual of hope for over 300,000 families. They kept their savings books in drawers, tucked between linens, proof of a future that never arrived. As the war machine accelerated, the regime moved to liquidate that future. Without notice, the promise of the car was revoked. Citizens who arrived at the post offices to make their regular deposits found the windows shuttered. Those who tried to reclaim their savings were met with cold, standardized rejections. There were no explanations, only the silence of bureaucratic finality. The money had already been diverted. It was not sitting in vaults. It was being poured into the production of shells, engines, and armored plating. The dream had been a thin veil, a method for the state to extract capital from the very people it intended to mobilize for war. Families watched their years of discipline turn into nothing more than numbers in a ledger that had been zeroed out. The betrayal was total. There was no recourse, no appeal, and no return of the wealth that had been surrendered in good faith. The factory grew, fueled by the stolen aspirations of the populace, while the people were left with empty booklets and the dawning realization that they had been sold a lie. The engines of war demanded a pace the current workforce could not sustain. As men were drafted to the front, the massive assembly lines at Wolfsburg began to stutter. The rhythm of production, once constant, grew erratic. Machines sat idle, cold to the touch, their gears motionless, for hours at a time. Ferdinand Porsche walked the length of the hall, his boots echoing against the concrete, noting the growing gaps where operators should have been. The output plummeted. Production quotas set by the high command became impossible to meet with a depleted staff. The pressure from the regime intensified, demanding results regardless of the human cost. In a quiet, sterile office, the solution was drafted. It was not a call for more volunteers or a restructuring of shifts. It was a proposal to bypass the limits of the local population entirely. The plan was precise: secure a new, inexhaustible supply of labor that owed nothing to the state and required no wages. It was a pivot from industrial management to human exploitation. With the stroke of a pen, the factory would cease to be a place of commerce and become a site of systematic forced labor. The moral threshold had been crossed, and the path to total inhumanity was now open. The order arrived with the finality of a death sentence. Hitler signed the mandate, and the industrial blueprint of the factory expanded to include the geography of imprisonment. Within days, the landscape around Wolfsburg began to shift. Where there had been open fields and access roads, crews hammered posts into the frozen earth. Barbed wire, razor-sharp and coiled, was strung across the perimeter. 4 distinct camps rose with terrifying speed, their wooden barracks cast long, jagged shadows over the production halls. This was not merely an expansion of facilities. It was the creation of a closed ecosystem of terror. Surveyors paced the grounds, marking the boundaries where the factory ended and the prison began. The workers were no longer employees. They were captives within a system designed for total containment. Heavy gates were installed, and guard towers emerged as the final vertical points of the new architecture. The air changed. The familiar noise of machinery was now punctuated by the rhythmic clanging of locks and the shouting of guards. Every entrance was monitored. Every exit was blocked. The factory had become a fortress, and its walls were now designed to keep people in rather than keep the world out. The transition was complete. The machinery of industry and the machinery of death were now one and the same. The factory doors groaned open, and the first wave of captives was driven inside. Tens of thousands of people, hollowed by hunger and exhaustion, were funneled onto the assembly lines. The atmosphere shifted from the quiet of construction to the roar of forced industrial output. Massive conveyor belts groaned into motion, setting a pace that ignored the state of the living. Prisoners stood at their stations for 16 hours, their hands moving in repetitive, desperate patterns to keep the machines fed. The rhythm of the factory was relentless. Metallic clangs and the hiss of steam drowned out any human sound. When a worker stumbled from fatigue, the line did not stop. It pushed forward, forcing the next person to compensate for the gap. The mechanical efficiency was absolute, fueled by the slow collapse of the human laborers. Bodies slumped against the cold steel, yet the work continued, driven by the overseers watching from the walkways above. Each movement was a struggle against gravity and failing strength. The machines hummed with precision, indifferent to the trembling fingers and the eyes that had long ago lost the ability to focus. Here, the boundary between the worker and the tool dissolved. The assembly line demanded constant motion, and it would consume every ounce of life until nothing remained but the relentless, rhythmic output of the factory floor. The factory floor demanded constant, uninterrupted motion, yet the biological reality of the female workforce created a friction the management refused to tolerate. Production reports flagged the loss of hours as a critical inefficiency. The solution was not compassion, but a cold, administrative pivot. They designated a site within the perimeter for the containment of the next generation. This was the birth of the Kinderheim, a facility built to strip away the conflict between motherhood and the assembly line. 2 wooden barracks were cleared at the edge of the complex, fenced off from the main grounds. The intent was not care, but sequestration. By housing the infants in these isolated structures, the factory ensured that the mothers remained tethered to their machines, their productivity prioritized over the survival of their children. The facility was designed to function like any other piece of equipment, a holding pen for human capital. When the doors to the Kinderheim were locked, the logic of the factory was finalized. The company had engineered a system where the process of life itself was converted into a logistical hurdle to be managed and minimized. The nursery stood as a testament to a new, extreme level of systemic cruelty, ensuring that the rhythm of the machines would never be interrupted by the needs of the living. Labor did not grant rest. It was a brief, violent interruption in the factory schedule. As soon as the infant was delivered, the process of extraction began. There was no recovery period, no holding of the child, no moment of connection. Guards entered the infirmary room, their presence a signal that the time for production had resumed. They reached for the newborn, pulling the small, fragile weight from the mother's chest. She reached out, fingers clawing at the air, but her strength was gone. Her body was still trembling from the effort of birth, yet she was hauled upright. She was forced to walk. Every step tore at her, but the overseers were relentless. They marched her back to the assembly line, placing her hands once again upon the cold, vibrating steel of the machine. The rhythm of the factory swallowed her sorrow. She looked toward the distant wooden barracks where her child had been taken, but the line moved, and she was forced to move with it. If she stopped, the production count fell. If she wept, the overseers struck. She stood at the station, a hollow shell, working in a daze while the machines hammered out their relentless, metallic pulse. The separation was absolute. The machine had reclaimed its asset, and the life she had just brought into the world was already lost to the silence of the barracks. Inside the 2 wooden barracks, the air hung heavy and stagnant. There was no ventilation. The floorboards were slick with layers of dried filth and waste that had not been cleaned for weeks. Dozens of infants lay in rows on damp, rotting straw, their small movements weak and sluggish. They were not crying. They had long since lost the energy to demand attention. Lice crawled across their skin in visible clusters, burrowing into the soft folds of their necks and limbs. Maggots moved through the soiled rags that served as their only bedding, feeding on the remnants of decay. The smell was suffocating, a mix of ammonia, sweat, and the sour rot of bodies that had never been bathed. When one infant shifted, a cloud of insects rose, buzzing in the dim, stale light, before settling back onto the exposed skin. Some of the children lay motionless for hours, their eyes glassed over, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling planks. No hands came to wipe their faces or turn them. No one entered to clear the waste. The neglect was absolute, a systemic hardening of the heart that left these children to be consumed by the filth of their own existence. It was a place where life was not being nurtured, but slowly, systematically erased by the environment itself. The winter wind bit into the barracks through gaps in the splintered walls. Outside, the temperature plummeted, turning the ground to iron. Inside, the cold was a physical weight, pressing down on the rows of infants. The staff maintained the temperature by design. They walked past the windows, their hands passing over the latches without stopping. They refused to close them. When the wind howled through the cracks, it carried snow inside, dusting the small, still forms with a fine layer of white. The infants shivered, their movements becoming slower, then stopping entirely. One of the nurses moved through the aisle, carrying a bucket of water. She did not stop for the cries that occasionally broke the silence. She did not stop for the ones who had ceased to move. When the time came for feeding, the staff turned away. They held the supplies in the next room, behind a locked door, and refused to distribute the milk. The infants were left to wither, their skin turning blue from the biting draft. The staff watched from the doorway, their expressions vacant, their movements precise and deliberate. They were not merely failing to care, they were actively ensuring that the cold did its work. Every open window was a choice. Every withheld bottle was a decision to accelerate the end. In the freezing dark, the malice was absolute. A high-ranking official stepped through the door, his boots thudding against the dirt-caked floorboards. He paused, his breath hitching as the air hit his lungs. He walked down the narrow aisle, looking at the rows of infants. He stopped beside a crate where a child lay motionless, its skin translucent and gray. He leaned in, his face twisting in genuine momentary revulsion. He looked up at the staff member following him, his hand gesturing toward the room. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice tight. "There must be a more humane approach to this situation." The staff member did not flinch. He did not look at the children. He stood by the door, his hands resting on his hips, and let out a short, dry sound. He offered a slow, sarcastic shrug, the movement dismissive and practiced. "They are just numbers," the staffer replied, his tone flat. "The machines need the labor, and these are merely the byproducts of the process." The official stared at him for a long beat, then looked back at the rows of children. He said nothing more. He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. The staff member watched him go, then stepped forward and pushed the door shut, locking it with a sharp click. The issue was dismissed. The system remained unchanged. When the silence finally claimed an infant, the administrative machine did not pause. The process of disposal was as systematic as the production line. Staff members gathered the small, cold forms and wrapped them in thin, brittle sheets of toilet paper. There were no shrouds, no ceremonies, and no names recorded. The bodies were placed into discarded cardboard boxes, the kind used for factory parts. But the cruelty reached beyond the grave. The company issued invoices to the grieving mothers, demanding payment for the burial costs of their own children. These women, exhausted from the machines, were forced to hand over their meager earnings to cover the price of their infant's final, undignified departure. A cart arrived at the barracks, loaded with these boxes. It was wheeled to the outskirts of the facility, where a pit had been dug into the frozen earth. The boxes were tipped over, one after another, spilling the contents into the mud. Dirt was shoveled over the pile, sealing the evidence of the Kinderheim away. Between 365 and 400 infants were discarded in this manner. The factory continued to hum, the machines never stopping for the dead, as the soil settled over the mass graves. The year 1945 arrived with fire, not of production, but of total collapse. Allied bombs tore through the Wolfsburg complex, reducing the sprawling assembly lines to twisted steel and shattered glass. Amidst the chaos, a mid-level bureaucrat sat in a dim room, surrounded by stacks of files that detailed the operation of the Kinderheim. A direct order arrived: destroy the evidence. He looked at the documents, the names of the mothers, the death counts, and the invoices for burial costs. He knew the weight of these pages. He stood, grabbed a pile of blank stationery from his desk, and tossed it into the hearth. He watched the flames consume the empty sheets, turning them into gray ash. He waited until the fire died down, then carefully tucked the real, incriminating files into a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. He stood up, dusted his hands, and walked out into the smoke-filled air. The order had been carried out, or so his superiors would believe. The evidence was safe. The truth of the nursery and the graves would not be lost in the rubble. He left the building, disappearing into the ruins, leaving behind a legacy that would eventually force the world to look at what had happened here. Major Ivan Hurst stepped over a jagged piece of steel, his boots crunching against pulverized brick and glass. The silence that hung over the Wolfsburg complex was heavier than the smoke that still curled from the twisted rafters. He moved past the hollowed-out assembly halls, where the machines lay silent and broken. Then, he saw them. A group of men and women emerged from the shadows of the debris. Their movements slow and labored. They were gaunt, their eyes sunken, moving with a hollow exhaustion that spoke of years spent under the whip. Hurst stopped, scanning the perimeter of the site. He looked at the barracks, then back to the people who had survived the collapse of the regime. He walked into the center of the yard, where the air felt thick with a residue that had nothing to do with the war. He began to piece together the fragments of what had transpired here. He saw the remnants of the Kinderheim, the small, derelict structures that stood in stark contrast to the industrial scale of the factory. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The blood-stained legacy of the site was not just written in files, but etched into the very ground he stood upon. He looked at the skeletal survivors, then back at the ruins, finally grasping the true dark scope of the horror that had been hidden behind the factory walls. Ivan Hurst stood in the center of the debris, his gaze fixed on the tangled skeleton of the main assembly line. The steel was cold, twisted by heat and impact, yet it held the weight of 1,000 decisions. He knew the engines would roar again. He knew the factory would rise from this rubble to define the future of mobility. But as he looked at the ground beneath his feet, the scale of the past proved impossible to overlook. He walked toward the perimeter, where the earth remained scarred by the barracks that had housed the children. There was no way to rebuild without acknowledging what lay in the soil. The success of the years to come would always stand upon this foundation of ash and tragedy. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind whistle through the jagged holes in the walls. The history of the Kinderheim was not a chapter that could be turned or forgotten. It was a jagged, dark mark, burned deep into the identity of the company. It would remain there, long after the steel was straightened and the machines were replaced. Hurst turned away from the ruins, carrying the weight of that truth, knowing that while the world might look forward, the foundation would forever bear the stain of those who were lost.